Hey guys, welcome to the Hypertrophy Hub podcast. So this week I'm speaking to Brian Miner. So I'm very, very excited to speak to Brian because Brian is one of those people where I look at him in terms of programming and I wish I could someday get to his level of understanding of the stuff because I've learned a lot from him over the years. And yeah, last time I spoke to Brian, I knew basically nothing about programming, and now I know a little bit more, but still significantly less than Brian. So if you don't know who Brian is, I hope you do. You should definitely give him a follow on Instagram or on other platforms. He writes for Myo Journal. He's also a natural pro bodybuilder and powerlifter. He also did his master's in health and exercise science at Colorado State University, and also has his CSCS. And he was involved in the JPS mentorship as a lecturer. So, Brian, I think you've been doing some really cool things for a long time in terms of sort of enlightening people on how to program for hypertrophy. And I guess as we've discussed, you've outlined quite well what progressive overload is, how do we actually achieve that, et cetera, et cetera. First of all, I think it would be a good idea to touch on just briefly what do we need for progressive overload? What is the bare minimum, and then does it change from bare minimum to can we boost the signal to achieve more overload, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me on.
My
I'm
pleasure.
excited to talk about this. And I'm glad we're getting the overload discussion out of the way first. So yeah, when it comes to progressive overload, really, I split it up in terms of, there's overload, defining what that is, and defining what progressive overload is. And overload, I think, is best just defined as providing a sufficient stimulus to spur a positive adaptation, to elicit a subsequent positive adaptation in the post-exercise period. And progressive let me keep going on the overload part. So with that said, when it comes to hypertrophy, in order to what is a positive adaptation for hypertrophy? It's additional muscle proteins. So it's the amount of stimulus that's ultimately going to tip the scales in favor of muscle protein synthesis over breakdown in that post-exercise window. So that value is, there's always going to be kind of that minimum effective amount, but what's optimal at any given point, or what will maximize that effect, is going to be influenced by a lot of different variables. Nutrition, sleep, stress, mood state, which would fall under stress. But when we have those adaptations, and probably the best proxy we have for hypertrophy, like over the long run, outside of actual visible changes, is performance increases. And there's contingencies there, but ultimately, if you're improving in a lift over time, like across multiple sets, and you see this upward trend, it's not just from 1 week to the next, a gradual trend that can't really be explained by those acute variables, then chances are you're growing, and that is confirmation that you're providing an adaptive stimulus, which is another way to think of overload. It's an adaptive stimulus. And as those adaptations occur, your capacity to perform increases, because now your muscle, each muscle fiber, all else equal, a larger muscle fiber will produce more force. And so your ceiling, your fitness level increases. And in order to stay within that adaptive range, you have to work a little bit harder. And that's something that occurs over a longer period of time as adaptations occur. And progressive overload then is it's the observation of this increase in performance as a result of these prior adaptations. And like, it is a little bit of a chicken or the egg scenario. because you do have to do more over time in order to continue to overload. But overload is not predicated on doing more than the last session. It's predicated upon the magnitude of adaptations that you've had up to that point. So yeah, does that
Yeah. Do you feel as though, yeah, so I guess with that last statement, it's sort of along the lines of like, effectively, the last session is relatively irrelevant, would you say? Because effectively there's so many variables that go into that. And then if you understand fitness fatigue model, it's like, it's not necessarily the marker with which to sort of change things by, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I don't
Yeah.
think your last session is going to strongly change and dictate where the overload threshold is. I think that's something that occurs over time is adaptations occur.
Yeah.
And if you haven't had really significant adaptation since your last session, or at least a small amount that doesn't really amount to large performance changes, then that's not really raising that threshold all that much. I mean, it is to a small degree, but a good example of this is if you perform, say you did 10 reps at an 8 RPE, and then the next session you got 10 reps at an 8, or let's say a 7.5 RPE. It's like you're still at the same number of reps, but maybe that one more additional rep, like enough adaptation hasn't yet occurred to accommodate that being at an 8. Or I'm sorry, for you to get 11 reps at an 8, so I think, yeah,
And then
I don't think it's not predicated on the last session really ever.
Yeah. And just so
unless maybe you're a beginner. If you're a beginner, then that's possible. It is.
Yeah. But for the majority of, I guess, the kind of people who would be listening to this podcast, it's more quite advanced, relatively in-depth knowledge of hypertrophy training. Probably, ideally, not sort of like 2 weeks into training. Hopefully not. Be pretty intense then. But I would like to outline a few more variables. So in terms of novelty, is there a bare minimum threshold of variation or novelty that you think should occur? And then I guess, is novelty, I guess, not the same as muscle damage, but would you say is it like a linear graph if you graph those together, if that makes sense?
I think I understand what you're trying to say. So I think novelty probably plays some role. I don't think we know the magnitude of the role it plays, and ultimately, I like to fall back on sort of the kind of what we just discussed with overload, and that's like, if you're progressing with a specific movement, even if it feels like you've been doing it a long time and you're still progressing with it, then it's like, is it really worth the variation? Like, do you need to change anything? Probably not. And so, like, I program novelty more, or I should say variation.
Yeah.
Variation more in place to, make sure I'm, hitting a muscle from multiple angles.
Yeah.
More from a perspective of enjoyment and compliance and, joint integrity than I am for hypertrophy.
Yeah.
Because I think, you can run away with that pretty easily. And if you have too much variation, then it's hard to assess the effectiveness of your strategy.
Yes.
Because you aren't able to compare apples to apples nearly as often. So
would you say that is mainly just because of the neuromuscular adaptations that occur? And effectively, it's like, if you're adapting to get used to doing a movement if you change it every mesocycle or something, it's like, or even less often than that, it's like what is really adapting here, I guess.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly like the big factor. But I don't know. I'm not sure how much in reality, like an isolation movement, for example, like if we're
Yeah.
talking about different variations of a bicep curl, like I don't think if you wanted to change that every week, like I
Mm.
don't think that's really going to be a bad thing. You might not be able to, like, if you're confident you're performing in an adaptive range for volume and you want to do that, then it's fine, I would say.
Mm.
It's when you get into more like multi-joint, more skill dependent movements that I think it becomes more of an issue. Um, but I also, even then, I think with training experience, you know, the motor learning component it's a much more efficient process.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. And then I guess one of the big topics that I would like to get into, and I think it's one that we really, really often, I think, is misinterpreted. And then once it is understood, it's misapplied, would be volume. It's like, it's very, very hard to, I don't know if you've seen that meme by my friend Aaron Hoey, where it's like, it's a coffee cup and then it's like inexperienced coach and they're pouring a bunch of coffee in the cup and the cup's just overflowing.
Yeah.
And it's, I've misapplied it for sure. And would you be able to sort of define volume, and then I guess from there, how do you personally think? Um, how do you personally like to change volume over a specific mesocycle, and then would you also, and I guess just for hypertrophy, for all of this hypertrophy only, love that. But it's like, like, would that be? And I guess it's hard to know what's optimal. It's impossible, obviously, as Lyndon has said. The singularity will come before we know, or something like that. And so, with volume, is there a way that you personally like to progress over a mesocycle for volume? Is there something that you do? How much does that change for you? And then over the macro cycle, or over multiple mesocycles, how do you personally like to adapt volume?
Well, first, you'd mentioned defining volume, and I think the the physiological definition, that I think makes the most sense is the total amount of mechanical tension. The magnitude and duration, or what we sometimes call impulse.
Mm.
But that's not something that a number we actually measure. But that's like on the physiological level, that seems to be what is the most likely, what I would speculate anyway, is the most predictive, because we know there's a time component to this, um, and we know you have to recruit high threshold motor units to maximize hypertrophy. So there's like a qualitative component, um, but then accruing enough volume or enough like exposure to that condition,
Yeah.
exposure to a fully recruited condition where you're producing force. And
Mm.
whether you want to think of that as like effective reps, or number of hard sets, like I think the same bottom line, like
Yeah.
it's we're looking at overall tension.
Yeah. And effectively that condition would be, in general, would you agree, 3 to 4 reps in reserve, given that we can gauge it accurately?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the research shows there's a minimal level of effort that's required. Um, and there's also research showing no differences between, slightly submaximal sets and failure.
Mm.
And, within the context of a whole program and managing fatigue, leaving a little bit in the tank for most sets is probably advantageous. So
Mm.
I think, within 4 reps in reserve and below, I think is probably where you should be spending most of your time. And
Yeah.
I don't know too many people, I'm sure there are some, but I think most people are probably in agreement there that, leaving 7 reps in the tank isn't going to be doing you any
Yeah.
favors.
Yeah.
So
I think there's still a strong camp of people. I think people are coming around to it more, but people
well,
definitely
I
still.
think a lot of people, once they start thinking less in terms of tonnage and more in
Yeah.
terms of physiological stress,
Yeah.
it's easier to buy into that.
Yeah.
And I used to kind of think in terms of mathematical volume previously too, but
Yeah.
like your body doesn't know how
Yeah.
much mathematical
No.
volume.
Yeah.
It knows the imposed stress that it's responding and adapting to a stressor, not a
The amount of
number.
mechanical tension, like for instance, if form fails, mechanical tension changes, but tonnage might stay the
Mhm.
same. So it's
True.
yeah.
Yeah. So, and that sort of segues into the next question you had is with progression or setting up a mesocycle. If I have somebody that I haven't worked with before, it's good to know how much volume they've been doing.
Mm.
But I think where a lot of people sort of go wrong is they assume, okay, X athlete has been doing, 20 sets per body part per week for chest. So now like that is where they're adapted. They assume, they have this assumption that like this is the floor now. Like we have to be at least here or above. And so
Mm.
there's often times where and I guess that's inaccurate because, or at least in most cases, because we know volume has this inverted U relationship. And um, if you think of an inverted U on an X and Y axis, like where it crosses the X axis, that would everything above the X axis is positive adaptation or positive progress. And so technically, like maximum recoverable volume, it's like anything you're recovering to would be above that axis. So it would be where that line crosses the x-axis on the right side. And so you can be recovering from training, but it not be the optimal amount of stimulus. Like you could still be doing too much or beyond what's optimal. And so that sweet spot, it's going to depend on a lot of variables, like we talked about, but I find a lot of people who are a little bit misled by the more volume is better mentality. We oftentimes dial back volume in order to, bring fatigue down a little bit, and they end up making better progress.
Mm.
And the qualitative aspect of the work they're putting in goes up. And so, like say I start somebody on kind of in that mid range. Let's say we start with an educated, guess of where they may be. And maybe we start a little bit below that. Like we know 10 to 20 sets per week per body part. If you're in there, you're somewhere in there in the mid teens it's a fair starting point for most people. And maybe you start a little bit below that and then assess if you're making progress. But I definitely don't start people at or above what they list in their enrollment form just out of assumption that that's necessary, because in many cases it's not.
Yeah.
But from there, it's, and this goes back to the overload concept again, like it's a reactionary approach. It's like, is this level of volume, is there evidence that this is an adaptive stimulus? And we can't look in the mirror on a week-to-week basis and say like, okay, like 4 sets of bicep curls is obviously working for me. You have to look at it and extrapolate from the data you have available. So you have to if you've got some additional reps from one week to the next, keeping volume the same, then that's it's more likely evidence that it's an overloading stimulus than it's evidence that you should be doing more. So I take more of a reactionary approach to volume increases. Like the big criteria that I have for staying put on volume, and a lot of people will disagree with this, but are you making progress, in terms of performance, and are you staying healthy? And if both of those are true, and they're not feeling physically run down or mentally run down, then there's really no reason to increase. And I think the idea of, okay, well, maybe you're not getting optimal progress. What if you're at MEV? Well, I know, especially like in advanced training populations, like any progress is good progress. I think anybody will accept consistent progress of any magnitude,
Yeah.
at an advanced level. So if you're getting progress, at whatever magnitude, then like, okay, if I increase volume, there's no guarantee that that's going to make things better. Like that, it may make things worse. Like we talked about, people come to me with doing exorbitant amounts of volume, and we dial back, and they make better progress. So there's no perfect way to know. Like I wish there was, but in reality, there's no way to know what the perfect amount of volume is to do on any given session. And there's people look at things like heart rate variability, and there's all these other measures that have been proposed and theorized to work, but in reality, like I think it's I personally like to just look at performance and look at historical data and think, okay, if this was providing an adaptive stimulus, if I was progressing 3 weeks ago, let's say I hit a wall, let's look at all of the other behavioral factors that could be influencing this. Like if I was seeing a nice upward trend, last block at this amount of volume, and now it's, let's say nothing's happening. Let's look at sleep. Let's look at nutrition. Are there other factors that can explain this dip?
Yeah.
Outside of just insufficient volume. And most often, more often than not, there is, when I have make those observations. So, so usually, like, to answer your question, rarely do I accumulate volume across a block, but I'll, start at a range that I think is reasonable based off of my own historical data, or the data of the individual in conjunction with follow-up questions. It's like, okay, are you staying healthy at this amount of volume? Are you how much progress have you made in these lifts, like, over time? All of this stuff is going to kind of play a role. But in the end, I think it's always some type of educated starting, like it's an educated guess. And then from there, it's assessing things and using emerging information to shape the rest of your strategy. But usually across a block, I'll have sort of a ramp up or intro week, whatever you want to call it, to ease into whatever volume we're doing. Maybe it's across 2 weeks, and then we'll keep that. Generally, I'll keep it static until a deload. But of course, if they're not progressing on anything, like you also have to consider, like, energy balance is a huge one here. Like in like contest prep, at the end of prep, it's like you may be losing strength, and you may see these lifts going down, especially like compound lifts, but you may be doing the right amount of volume. So it's like you have to consider the environment that you're training in as well.
Regardless, it might be too stressful or not conducive to adaptation. Yeah.
And I mean, if you're seeing a decrement in progress, or not seeing progress, and it's due to fatigue or recovery capacity, and your solution is to add more volume, I mean, that's just going to make the situation worse. So I think it's just
are people misinterpreting, like, are people looking at volume as sort of being able to use that to increase the stimulus, like, and then that's disregarding the amount of extra fatigue you're accumulating?
I think people often do that. It's like there's always a cost associated with volume, and that's specialization phases are a good example of this.
Yeah.
Like in many cases, and I've told this anecdote
Mm.
probably 5 times at this point on different podcasts, but I've had powerlifters who are unable to train their squat and deadlift for say 6 weeks. Like that, say they get knee tendonitis and we have to
Yeah.
back off, or maybe we don't stop training, but it's a significant reduction in stimulus.
Mm.
And we don't even, in many cases, add volume to bench, and we'll see bench go up.
Right. Just
And
because.
it's happened enough for me to be very confident that there's something there in terms of
Do you feel like it's
having this pool of adaptive resources that you're freeing up,
Yeah.
and you have this extra currency to spend on the lifts that you're doing. But that's in the absence of really changing anything on the lift that's going up. So yeah, I think managing I'm not saying there's never a time and place to push volume more assertively, but I think there are a lot of people that are making very reasonable progress, or would be making very reasonable progress if they were patient, that are redlining the volume a bit too soon. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's there's not a system necessarily to know if what you're doing is right. It's like it's just understanding the influential variables, and like the common statement in the evidence-based fitness sector, like it depends. It's like it's sort of, it bothers me when that's used without like any follow-up explanation.
Well, I guess people commonly, I'd say, they don't actually understand. Like, I think even high-level coaches, I think commonly, like, understanding these things to that degree, I think is very, I don't know if it's that common. I think people don't make the ties between all the variables correctly, or they see them in isolation. Like they see, like when you're talking before about sort of the amount of sort of, I guess, the pool of recovery that we have, people see that, and then they kind of see that in isolation to the amount of volume they're doing, and they don't see the link between those. Or if they do, then they say, they don't think, okay, how much, this is why submaximal training might be so useful. So it's like, I don't think people tie all these things together. And I think sometimes when people, some people, when people tie it together for other people, they will misinterpret it, or they will misuse it. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm making much sense there.
Yeah, no, it absolutely makes sense. And I agree.
Because even myself as a coach, I'm still figuring out how to understand these things, and I get to have conversations with people like yourself. And it's like, then think of the coach who doesn't get to have these conversations, doesn't get the privilege of asking these questions. It's like, I can see why it would be so misinterpreted, I think.
Yeah, no, and I think, I've been there. Like, I think any coach, nobody is, and I'm still there in some areas. It's like advancing as a coach and growing as a coach takes the ability to acknowledge where you have gaps and blind spots, and it's a quest to fill those. And even it's also understanding that there's questions that you won't get answers to, that we still don't know. And and so I think forgot what your original question was.
no worries. So
what I was going to say, I remember now. So I think rather than looking at where is my threshold, where is my what is my maximum adaptive volume, or where, rather than thinking in terms of quantifiable numbers, I look at it, and I recommend people sort of think of it more along the lines of just concepts, understanding what can, cause that needle to rise and fall.
Yeah.
And as long as you're aware of that, like, you can usually stay steered in the right direction.
Mm.
And like the other thing with like knowing, like, okay, like I know the optimal amount of volume for my lats is 18, between 16 and 18 sets a week. Like, I know I can't confidently state a range like that. And the other thing to think about is, all of the things that influence that outside of just exercise selection. But then you start thinking about exercise selection, and that has a huge role. It's like you could change the way you perform pull downs and immediately see your optimal volume go down by 30%. You know what I
Yes,
mean? And
exactly.
so
Yeah.
it's
Because
there's just so many influential variables in all of it. I think it's just, understanding the concepts and knowing how to integrate those more so than searching for values.
Yeah. Do you think there's been attempts to be quite reductionist with it, I guess, or like simplify it, I guess? Like my kind of follow-up question was going to be, do you think muscle damage can lead us astray, or muscle soreness can lead us astray? Like, do you think people, like, for instance, one thing that I don't yet understand is over a mesocycle, let's say if the stimulus, let's say somehow if we know that we are overloading every week, we know performance is changing, but the performance is increasing over the mesocycle, right? Would you still expect soreness to go down, or would you expect soreness per week to stay the same, or it's way too hard to guess, or like, is there trends you've seen anecdotally, or?
I think that I've seen a little bit of all of it in practice, because the longer somebody's been training, the less they're going to experience that. And if it's a movement that they've, say it's a power lifter who's back squatting, very few power lifters are, they don't experience delayed onset muscle soreness to the degree bodybuilders do.
Right,
and I think a lot of it's more to do with just the consistency of exercise selection, probably more than anything. But usually if I see someone's soreness like escalating significantly across a mesocycle, I start to wonder, like, okay, what does their recovery environment look like right now? Or is it possible we're doing a little bit too much? Because you should be recovering session to session most of the time.
So soreness should be, and by recovery, do you mean soreness, or do you mean like soreness should be eliminated?
What I'm using sort of the definition of a return to baseline performance, like the scientific, the sports science way of thinking about recovery. And it's possible to see that occur in the presence of muscle damage, and it's possible to still make adaptations in the presence of muscle damage. But what it seems to be an issue is when muscle damage is to the point where it starts to like limit central drive, it starts leading to central fatigue.
So you can't perform, or you're inherently limited.
So it's like you don't even, I mean, this is sort of a reductionist way to think of it, but it's like you don't even have access to
the
top threshold motor units. It's like, so your capacity, like your ceiling for performance is lower. So even if you recruit what you have available, your body's not letting you recruit what you have available.
So you effectively cannot do what's necessary.
So like you sometimes, like in theory anyway, you could be, you could be just totally missing out on some of the highest threshold motor units. And Chris Beardsley has written quite a bit about this specifically, and this is kind of where I started to connect some of the dots reading some of his work. So I'd recommend people look at
I've thoroughly
his
enjoyed his
blog.
work recently too. Yeah.
Yeah, so he talks quite a bit about muscle damage. But yeah, I think it's something that we should control rather
Mm.
than chase. And um, if it provides soreness and muscle damage, they're associated, but they're not interchangeable terms.
Mm.
But if there's one thing that soreness can tell us is like you're hitting the muscle group that you're intending to hit,
Yeah.
and so like there is that. But I think where people run into trouble is like, I'm not getting sore anymore, like I
Right.
need to add volume, or I
Yeah.
need to change the exercise. And
Yeah.
then they increase their novelty, they experience muscle damage, but in the process it's like they're experiencing muscle damage because of the novelty, not
Yeah.
necessarily because they're all of a sudden hitting the muscle group. And
Yeah. Do you feel like it's a misunderstanding of, I guess, novelty and the actual adaptations that would be occurring instead of
yeah,
actually hypertrophy?
yeah.
It's like,
And I think muscle damage is an area, like I'm not an expert in anything, first of all, but it's definitely an area that I think is still evolving, and I'm still interested in learning more about as well.
yeah.
Because there's a lot that hasn't been quite figured out there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's interesting. But the original question, like I've seen people that are pretty beat up by the end of a mesocycle in terms of soreness, and I've seen people that it's like their performance starts to taper off, but they haven't experienced any soreness yet, or they're
Yeah.
not like, they don't feel beat up.
Yeah.
And really that's probably the ideal scenario. It's like but then you have to consider like when we talk about fatigue masking adaptations, what types of fatigue are we really talking about then? If you're not experiencing muscle damage, then what is the resultant decrease in performance? What can that be attributed to? And my understanding of the literature is central fatigue is fairly, it's not like residual central fatigue is more tied to muscle damage. I know like you can have like the acute central fatigue by doing a ton of volume in one session. Like James Krieger has written about that some, as well as Chris. And there's like one of the theories of short rest intervals or longer rest intervals being better than short rest intervals is the shorter rest intervals can cause more central fatigue, and then in turn you're not able to recruit these higher threshold motor units. But when we look at like fatigue accumulation across a block, like what should we really expect to be happening? And in practice, we generally we may not see performance drop. Like I usually try not to wait until performance you see a decrement.
Do you feel like that's too far to then be like, that's the reason we call it deload? It's better to do it, I guess, preemptively, or you can kind of assume based on previous.
Yeah, I guess the way I see it is like eventually you're going to have to deload anyway, right?
Yeah.
And if you deload a hair early, it's not really going to hurt much. Like you come back fresher, regardless. So, but going too far, I mean, in theory, you can risk injury.
Yeah.
So I kind of have it depends on the situation, like a reactionary versus a proactive measure. Like in contest prep, when our durability might be a little bit lower, I tend to go more like a proactive approach to deloads.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you may not feel like shit right now, but in a week you may hit that wall. And that's something that you see happen in prep a lot.
Yeah. And do you think the ability to recover then is so hard you need to take the deload proactively rather than reactively?
Yeah, I think in those cases your capacity is much lower for recovery, or at least especially at the end. training during contest prep is a very interesting topic that,
Yeah.
or in a deficit at all,
Mm.
where we're extrapolating what we know from research where energy balance isn't
Yeah.
really controlled. So that is a huge gap
Mm.
in the research, and so we have to lean heavily on anecdote there, within and use research to sort of shape the direction. But we say like recovery capacity drops, but
By how much? And
by how much?
yeah.
And anecdotally, I can't say I've seen huge drop-offs in volume throughout a contest prep.
Yeah.
Like in terms of number of sets. Like you have to realize too, like volume it's still a tool in
Yeah.
terms of getting the stimulus that we want.
Yeah.
If we can figure out a way to manage our fatigue better while still getting an ample, keeping the stimulus reasonably high, that's sort of what I approach the problem with,
And
rather
I
than
guess, would that be why
like
you would
I
have,
look.
if you prolong it, it's like, if you prolong the contest prep, it's like, and you have more like diet breaks, etc., that's when we can drop fatigue. And it's like, generally, would that could have play into that whole
I mean,
picture?
diet breaks will certainly help.
Mm.
I mean, a lot of the fatigue, like when we look at fatigue, we look at it as like central, peripheral, or muscle damage. And I think it's important to talk about what kind of fatigue. When people say
Yeah.
I'm fatigued, they're not really referring to any one of those in particular.
Yeah.
They're kind of looking at their subjective bottom line. Like I feel tired. I feel beat up.
Mm.
And so you could almost think of that as like psychological fatigue.
Yeah.
And I think in prep, managing that is extremely important, because it's already challenging enough with everything else. Like you want to prolong that feeling where it's like one foot in front of the other. You want to
Yeah.
prolong that as long as you can.
Yeah.
And when it comes to managing like your actual recovery capacity, like what we're really looking at there is like, how do we minimize like muscle protein breakdown, or how do we either minimize muscle protein breakdown or keep muscle protein synthesis elevated?
Yeah.
And there's evidence that some like the atrophy that's observed is largely driven by a decrease in synthetic response more so than a decrease in breakdown.
Right.
But I've also seen some research that has demonstrated some breakdown does occur. But in any case, the objective is still to skew things as much as you can towards synthesis. So you look at it like, okay, I can either increase the stimulus and make sure I keep MPS as high as I can, or mitigate breakdown. And that's like, let's make sure that we're recovering. That's basically, I mean, that's something like muscle protein breakdown, like putting the focus on that doesn't make a lot of sense, for reasons that extend beyond this. But like the flux in synthesis is really kind of the point I'm trying to make, in controlling that. Because if you're under recovered, that's really affecting the synthetic side more than it is like the breakdown side. Because if you're under recovered and you can't, turn up and have another productive session, then that's going to compromise like your, synthetic response. And all of this is sort of, conceptual here, but
theoretical, I guess.
So like when we look at it with a prep, keeping an ample stimulus in play is extremely important, and doing that in a manner that controls for fatigue. And this is where Dr. Mike Israetel, he's put some great brought some great concepts to the forefront with like the stimulus to fatigue ratio. And I think it's getting people to think conceptually about, each exercise, like exercise selection has a cost associated with it. And, deep into prep and, in fat loss phases, just in general, that seems to be the variable I find I'm adjusting the most. More so than number of sets. And I guess rep ranges, like volume is oftentimes kind of the least of the three that I mess with. It's like I'll keep it intact the majority of the time, but I may decrease intensity due to connective joint discomfort, but or connective tissue. But the exercise selection component is pretty huge, because going from a movement that you feel psychologically you're dreading and is wrecking you, something like a back squat or a deadlift from the floor deep into prep, and then all of a sudden you're doing like a hack squat, it's a lot easier to get a higher qualitative, like that ratio and can increase. And so I guess my point is, like, exercise selection, I don't think gets enough shine when it comes to the role it plays in all of this. It's always
especially
kind of the debate between volume and intensity. But exercise selection is
important for sure. I think people have trying to get in the mission of trying to get the point across that you can do any exercise. I think people have undermined the idea. Like, they've kind of undermined it by being like, hey, you can do any exercise. The barbell lifts aren't like golden. They're not special. People have then undermined the importance of exercise selection in terms of fatigue management.
I agree. And also exercise execution. That's going to play a huge role in your volume tolerance as well.
It's kind of like, without that being on point, everything else kind of gets thrown out the window. Like, if your exercise selection is like rack pulls, then it's like, it's, and you're doing that for hypertrophy, it's like, well, what's the trade-off there? Is that actually useful?
Exactly.
Et cetera, et cetera. I always find it fascinating listening to you talk about this stuff, because it's like, I think you have such a great idea of every individual variable, but then you're able to tie them together. And I think that's the problem I think we face, right? It's like, we have this, we can kind of, I think people can understand these variables on their own, kind of, but they don't know how to manipulate them over time. They don't know how to program, basically. And it's like, I think it's ridiculously hard. I think people don't understand it, but I think it's...
I appreciate that. But I think I would caution people too. Like, yes, all of that does matter. Like, the integration of it all matters. But at the end of the day, like, you have to pick a direction to go, and you have to be okay with the idea that there are some potential holes in that decision.
And that it is suboptimal.
There's no way or someone can honestly say, like, I know this is the 100% optimal way to approach this problem. And so you have to be comfortable with some unknowns, and at least continue to provide actionable information, or at least allow yourself to be actionable in your coaching, rather 100%. Than just analyzing until you just
do nothing.
Exactly.
I think it would be interesting to finish off with this. It's quite timely, but I think it's... No, I'm actually not going to ask that question, because I think it's too timely and I don't think it will last long enough. I was going to ask the coronavirus programming question, but I'm not going to. I think it would be interesting is that you've mentioned some people that you found useful for programming for hypertrophy. Would you be able to recommend some resources, like places people can go if they want to learn more about programming, if they want to understand these concepts better? Is there anywhere you found this?
Absolutely. Yeah, like I've said before, like nothing. I'm still learning, like any other coach, and I think any good coach is going to be able to say that and eager to point that out. I would say,
Mm,
um, and so I think there's been a lot of people that have helped sort of shape my beliefs towards things or my approaches towards things, and um, I some really good places like Mass is a great resource, and that's been within the past few years. But
mm,
some of the people that really helped shape my understanding of programming and initial, like when I first started coaching, um, Mike Zordos was a big one at Florida Atlantic University. He did some programming presentations. It was like 2013 maybe, um, for Mike Tashir. Mike Tashir had like a programming classroom thing,
wow.
and actually I worked with Mike in 2014 for USAPL Nationals, and so Mike had this educational platform at the time, or the RTS classroom, which I think he still has. So I would encourage people there. I mean, Mike is a very he's a great mind in the sport of powerlifting, and a lot of those principles can be carried over to bodybuilding as well. Um, but yeah, learning from him, like him and Mike Zordos, Eric Helms,
Mm,
um, Alberto Nunez, like close friend of mine, like they've all helped shape where I'm at. Um, James Krieger, weightology.net, phenomenal research review. That and Mass, it's like if you're subscribed to those, like you're going to, and you actually spend time committing to reading and um, giving yourself the opportunity to really absorb it and digest it and critically think about it. Like
mm,
it takes me a while to read some articles, because I have to sit and kind of look at it and try to sort of argue against my own initial impressions to see, like,
yeah.
okay, what other explanations could there be for this? So like I would just recommend coaches like take their time in how they, I guess, educate themselves,
Mm,
and don't rush to try to read everything you possibly can. Like
yeah.
I think it takes time to let things sort of you know sit, and for you to develop your own thoughts on them. But yeah, I would say like Mass, James Krieger's research review. Chris Beardsley is another great mind in the industry. Greg Knuckles um, has helped shape a lot of the way I think,
Mm,
especially like his pieces on the big three, like
yeah.
his guides for the big three. And he's, for people that aren't aware, is one of the contributing authors on Mass each month. It's Mike Zordos, actually, Eric Helms, Greg Knuckles, and Eric Trexler. Um, and so all of them are fantastic resources and great people too. So yeah, I think that's a good start.
Mm.
Um,
I think that all those names I
yeah,
can wholeheartedly agree with.
yeah,
Yeah, I absolutely, like, every time I've consumed Mass, it's like I think it's really important, as you said, like sit down, read it well. Like there's no point reading something you're just skimming it. Like especially something like that. It's not like low level basic stuff. It's quite advanced, but it's like it's understandable. It's not like overcomplicated. It's just you need to sit there and actually
yeah.
digest the utility of each piece, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And then we'll finish off there. So if people want to find yourself, where can they find you?
Probably Instagram. I mean, that links to everything else. It's at BD Minor. Um, and yeah, that'll link to my website and coaching page and contact form and everything if people want to reach out.
Sweet.
But yeah,
And currently no in-person coaching because quarantined, I assume.
no in-person coaching.
So,
I'm fortunate that like I have a home gym that, I mean, I've been training at home the majority of the past 2 years.
Mm.
So that's nice. It's not impacting me too much, but I know it's impacting a lot of people. And to kind of
Yeah.
touch on the question about coronavirus, like we were talking before the call, I think every online coach is sort of dealing with this. They're being forced to
In
get a
flux.
little bit creative.
Yeah.
And that's like, should
Mm.
embrace the challenge of that.
Yeah.
While also hoping it doesn't last very long.
Yeah,
So,
I know. I'm going to spend the rest of this afternoon, I'm going to go to my class, spend the rest of this afternoon basically programming for home programs, because
so
all of a sudden my clients have all been like, hey, help. Everyone around me has coronavirus. I can't go outside.
Yeah. So that's the one thing. I think people inherently, when they think like at home workout, they think this is going to be easy and ineffective. But I would much rather train in a gym than have to train like in terms of effort, because like having to push like a set of
really push while doing
25 on like goblet squats,
or doing
it's
like
like
table rows or something.
Yeah. Like all of those things. I mean,
it's hard to get there.
Since you're limited by load on a lot of the things, you have to go pretty high rep and relatively close to failure, and it's just not fun. It's uncomfortable.
No.
And one thing I have to give Jeff Alberts with 3DMJ a plug on this, because he
the water jug.
He made a post. Yeah, he like gallon water jugs. So I've noticed I've been mentioning that to a lot of athletes, because ordering dumbbells, it adds up quick.
Yeah,
the shipping and everything. So those are it's like the cheapest adjustable dumbbell you can get.
Yeah, it's pretty big, but I guess it works. Yeah,
it works.
And I guess you could theoretically put anything in it, like dirt or whatever.
You could.
So yeah, cool.